Welcome everyone to this first session of the year of the Mexican Studies Seminar here at the Katz Center for Mexican Studies at the University of Chicago. My name is Emilio Curia. I'm the center's director, and today, to begin 2026, we are very fortunate to have as our speaker Professor Filiz Garip. She is a professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University and a very well-known and distinguished scholar of mobility and migration. She describes her research as lying at the intersection of migration, economic sociology, and inequality, and is devoted to the study of mechanisms that enable or constrain mobility and lead to greater or lesser degrees of social and economic inequality. A few years ago, she published a very interesting and important book on these matters, concerning itself particularly with the Mexican case. And so we've now invited her a little belatedly, but nevertheless, I think quite aptly, given everything else that's going on, to come and join us to speak about the book. The title of the book is the title of her talk. For all of you who are joining us, perhaps for the first time, I should say that she will make a presentation, and then after that, we'll have some time for questions and comments. The title of the talk is On the Move, Changing Mechanisms of Mexico-U.S. Migration. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Filiz Garip. Thank you.
Hello, I'll start by sharing the slides and hopefully the technology will work. So thank you, Emilio, for inviting me. I'm really honored to present here, and thank you, Alberto, for managing the technical details here. Everything is going very smoothly. So this book came out a while ago, and it's the first time I'm presenting in a while, but I was really excited to go back to it because it's showing us one thing that I think is still relevant today: how dynamic migration is as a process, even from the same setting, how it changes over time, how it varies across individuals. So this project is looking at that in the last 50 years, from 1960s to about 2010 or so. And the book came out of Princeton, and it's a mixture of qualitative data based on about 150 interviews with families that we did in Mexico, some historical analysis, but mostly it has a very large quantitative core, meaning that I have used a large survey data that is still ongoing, called the Mexican Migration Project, to really understand these patterns. So researchers have basically been asking the same questions over the last 40 years, and that gives us a handle on seeing how the patterns have changed over time. So today I'll mostly talk about those core results, but I'm happy to talk about the qualitative components and other things during the Q&A. So, and all the photos I'm showing, I was very lucky to have an artist travel with me during my fieldwork. She actually came in as a translator and manager of the qualitative work, but it turned out she was a brilliant photographer. So all of them are taken by Patricia Martin, and they're also in the book. So the main question that is driving this project is, why do people migrate, right? And we ask this question in our fieldwork to people: why do you think so many people move? Is the way we put it at the end of the interviews. Once someone had told us their entire life story, we ask, why do you think this is happening? And this is what a former migrant we named Pedro said: every person is a different world. They think differently. So if you think about it, it's a very simple point, but it's also profound, pointing to diversity and heterogeneity in the migration process. So if we look at the US now, there are about 10, 12 million Mexican born in the United States. About half of them are undocumented. So what we're trying to understand here is, who are these people and what has brought them here, and how has that changed over time? Now, as a social scientist, I'm a sociologist and a demographer. I have a past life as an engineer. And one of the things that is remarkable about the field of migration is how interdisciplinary it is. So we have theories from sociology, my current field, but also ideas from demography, from economics, from historians, anthropologists. So how do we kind of make sense of these theories is another concern here. So I'm going to focus on certain ideas here. So at the micro level, when we look at how we understand how people choose to migrate, there are a couple of theories that have been used over and over again. One is kind of the rational choice model that comes from economics. Basically, the idea is there are wage differences, employment differences between regions. And then as a person, I can make a very rational calculation about what I can make here versus what I can make elsewhere. And if I think the benefits outweigh the costs, I'll move. So it is seeking opportunity, basically what is driving migration. Now, another idea basically challenges this model as being too individualistic and talks about households. So family is a unit. It's not just about one person. There are several people involved. And because the family has several people, it can really allocate its resources, again, in a rational way, especially in places like Mexico, where there's a lot of volatility. There's a lot of economic insecurity that cannot be formally insured against. Like there are many things that can happen to you that you cannot be protected for. It makes sense for families to divide their labor resources, send some people overseas, and then others stay in Mexico. Maybe others move internally. That way you diversify your portfolio. This is the new economics of labor migration that is very popular in sociology and demography, and especially in the current context of climate-related migration, right? It's all about risk and people diversifying risk. And then there's a cumulative causation idea by Doug Massey, a giant in the field, who talks about the social process that develops once people start migrating out of a community. So with each migrant, the context is a little different. There are more people to hear about the United States. There are more people who can cross you over. And eventually it becomes a self-sustaining process. There's a culture of migration and community that makes it very easy to move. And migration itself can even be disconnected from the economic or other conditions that start. So these are all kind of micro level theories about how people can be compelled to migrate. They're also kind of more contextual macro level ideas, right? So there is the world systems theory that's all about relationships between countries. There is a capitalist system in the US, it's ever expanding, there's more economic ties. And as US expands into peripheral territories, there's disruptions that are happening. And these disruptions kind of mobilize people. This is the world systems idea. Another idea has to do with how advanced economies operate. There is a bifurcated kind of labor market where there are high-paying jobs that native-born take, and then low-paying manual jobs that require immigrants. This is the segmented labor markets idea. Basically, all of these theories are explaining both individual level motives and social and economic contexts that produce migration. Now, the big point is, I think all social scientists would agree that these theories are not mutually exclusive, meaning that one person can be migrating to increase their opportunities, another person can migrate to unify with their family members, or the same person can have both motives, right? But then, as social scientists, especially quantitative social scientists, we don't treat these theories as complementary. And we typically fail to capture causal heterogeneity. I think historians and qualitative researchers are much better at getting at the nuances of migration, that it can be different in different places. But as a quantitative social scientist, I can say that what we do basically flattens both the available explanations, and also it's very reductive in terms of the evidence that it provides. So what happens is most studies take the data and then try to characterize the average case. What does an average migrant look like? In the Mexican case, this average case, when you look at the data, is a young person, a young adult who comes from a poor community, poor family, typically rural areas of Mexico, very little education, and then central western states in Mexico are the main centers of migrants. Now you take this average case and then you try to select a theory that best accounts for that case. So in a way, you're pitting theories against each other, and then what you're looking for is the thing that seems to be explain the most variation in your data. Now, I want to step away from that approach and basically consider the following possibilities. One, different people can migrate for different reasons. And two, different theories might apply to different groups, or they might become more or less relevant under different circumstances. In other words, there might be a lot of heterogeneity in the process that we're trying to understand. Now, the main issue of the book is like, how do we capture this heterogeneity in migration behavior with large-scale data? Now, I have a very specific method here, and I'll go very quickly over this. Depending on the audience, I've spent a lot of time in these slides, but I'm assuming it's going to be boring more generally. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them later on. So what I do here is, in the data, we have about 140,000 individuals. This is the Mexican Migration Project data. And then I only look at people who have migrated at first. So fixing the outcome and studying only the migrants. And then I'm looking for different groups among migrants. Now, I'm defining these groups based on shared configurations of attributes. And by attributes, I mean their age, sex, family structure, income level, community characteristics, things like that. And the assumption here is that individuals who share similar attributes will face similar opportunity structures, both in Mexico and in the United States. Now, this is actually not uncommon, right? So in the social sciences, we typically look at different groups to understand the different mechanisms for outcomes. For example, we might look at men and women differently if we're interested in health outcomes. We might look at different age groups, different ethnicities, different racial groups. So this is a similar idea. The only difference is I'm not singling out one or two things like gender, age, or ethnicity. I'm considering all possible attributes that matter to migration, and I'm looking for configurations that define different groups. And I'm discovering these configurations inductively from the data. Now, once I have these groups, I study the conditions that set aside each group from the other groups, as well as from non-migrants. Like, what is distinct about this group, and what are the conditions under which it emerges as a migrant category? Okay, so this amounts to kind of asking three interrelated questions, and I'll go in this order in the talk. First, who migrates? Who are the migrants? Second, when does each group migrate? What are the circumstances? And third one, which is the hardest one to answer, why? Why is it that we see certain groups at certain times? Now, the data, this is a project, Mexican Migration Project, that started in the 1980s, and it was spearheaded at the time by Jorge Durand at the University of Guadalajara and Doug Massey. I believe he was at the University of Chicago at the time. So the project is still ongoing, and as Emilio mentioned, we had our latest meeting as the project team at the University of Chicago at the Katz Center. So the way kind of this data collection effort works is every year, 3 or 4 communities are selected in Mexico. And these communities tend to be in high migration areas. In other words, the data doesn't want to necessarily be representative of Mexico, but we want to capture the Mexican flow to the United States. So they purposefully select high migration areas. And in each community, they canvass the community and randomly select 200 households. So in those households, they collect information on everyone, and this information involves retrospective life history. So basically, we collect information on the timing of critical decisions. Migration is one of them. And we collect, again, time-varying decision on household wealth, household activities, and community structure. So this allows us to recreate people's lives. Although we observe each community and each person only once in the field, because we collect this retrospective information, we can recreate their life history backwards. So using this strategy, the data actually gives very good coverage of the period between 1965 and about 2010. Now, the main sample that I'm using here consists of about 20,000 migrants who are all on their first trip to the United States. So we fixed them on the year of their first trip to the US. We also observe repeated trips, but for now, I'm not going to focus on them because people and their context changes as they migrate. So I don't want to confound these two things, like changes that happen to people because of migration. Now, I also have information on about 120,000 people who have never migrated, right? And we're going to use that information later as well. But for now, just remember that we have 20,000 first-time migrants. The method I'm using, again, I'll go through this rather quickly, is something called cluster analysis. So we've all heard about rise of machine learning in computer science. Maybe these are these predictive tools, predictive black box models. Now, there's a class of these models that is not predictive, but descriptive, which is all about finding groupings in the data. And cluster analysis is one of these methods. And it's very simple. It basically discovers groups with similar attributes in the data. And qualitative social scientists naturally do this kind of typology building from the data based on configurations. This is just a quantitative way of doing that. Now, how it works is very simple. First, you need to kind of decide what you want to group people on. What are the attributes that matter to migration? Now, we know several demographic things that matter: someone's age, sex, education, also kind of income level, household wealth, and household size, whether they're married or not, the type of community they live in, the economic activities in their household and in their community. So I come up with 20 plus attributes like that, that all are known to matter to migration decisions. Now, these things can be measured on different scales. Many of the attributes are binary in the data, so it's a 0 or 1. Some of them have continuous values, like the value of the land you own. And these methods can be very sensitive to these different scales of variable. This is a technical thing. So basically, we turn everything into binary indicators, a 0 or 1. And if something is continuous, we basically use the median value to divide people into like low and high categories. For example, land ownership, or 0 or 1. You own land, any land, or some land. And then there are many algorithms that you can use. Again, this is an automated process. An algorithm goes through your data and these attributes and tries to kind of divide your data into groups. And here, the idea is we want to stay away from more black box and complicated methods, and we want to go with an as simple a method as possible so that we have a handle on it and we understand what it's doing. And the k-means algorithm is a very generic tool. It doesn't make any assumptions about the structure of the data, the distribution of your data. So it's the most generic tool that you can come up with. And the most important decision you make here is that how are you going to measure distance between people? Let's say you have all my characteristics and you have Alberto's characteristics. How are you going to determine how close we are to each other in this kind of multi-dimensional space? Again, simplicity is the key. I use something called the city block distance. So basically, remember, everything is a 0-1 indicator. We basically take the difference between me and Alberto on every attribute, sum it up, and that's the distance between us. So if we're identical on everything, we basically have a distance of 0. If we differ on everything, then the distance is maximum, like the number of attributes. If it's 20, the distance is 20. So it's likely that the algorithm is going to kind of put us in very different groupings. So these are the key decisions. And then this algorithm doesn't know how many groups exist in your data. Like you have to say, I'm looking for 2 groups, 3 groups, 4 groups. And a priori, you have no idea how many groups exist in your data. So what you do is you basically try all these different divisions, and then you use some measures to determine what is the optimal value. Where does the optimal separation exist? And in a way, kind of, there are different ways of approaching this, right? So on the one hand, you can say, I'm just going to look at this as something totally numerical and just say, I want the groups to be very, very different. And you can also look at it as substantively as a researcher and say, I'm going to just look at how the division is happening, and I'm going to see if it's meaningful to me, if I'm learning something new. So I did both of these things. And with cluster validation measures, which basically tells you how well separated the data are, 4 cluster solutions seem to be optimal. You also test for like how sensitive your solution is to removing certain indicators. You basically want to get a stable solution, right? And again, 4-group solution turned out to be good. But again, this is oversimplifying the work that went into it in terms of, as a researcher, sitting down and thinking about what this process is telling you. And there's a lot of back and forth. And as a novice qualitative researcher, I also code my interviews in that I found the process to be very similar to be like you first come up with a categorization scheme, but as you're reading more and more interviews, that evolves. You go back and adjust the categories and come back. So it is not different from that process. Okay, now what do we find? Who migrates? This is kind of the key question. Now, I like this figure a lot. I don't know if it's clarifying or confusing. This is what they call a heat map. So basically, in this heat map, we're showing the entire data in one figure. So every column here, every vertical line is one person in the data. And every row that you see is one attribute that they have. If they have it, it's gray. If they don't have it, it's white. So now you kind of put together people who ended up in the same group. The vertical black lines separate that. So by just looking at it from a distance, you can see where the white and gray areas fall and how the groups are different in terms of different attributes. But I'll basically walk you through the most important characteristics that stand out that define these groups. So we have 4 migrant groups. In the first group, almost everyone is a man. And they have, majority of them have no schooling. Over 60% of them have less than primary school education. This is like the largest uneducated group across all migrant groups. And they live in a farming community, almost all of them come from Central West. In the second group, now I'm highlighting again the distinguishing features, we have mostly teenagers. About 75% of these people are between ages 15 and 19. So these are basically boys, and they live in poor communities. They have a little bit more education than the first group. But in terms of owning a business or land, about half of them live in families with some property. So they're a little wealthier than the first group. In the third group, majority, about 85%, are women, and they're older than the other groups. And what makes them distinct is how tied they are to prior migrants. So either a parent or a husband or a sibling is a US migrant. And this is basically what sets them apart. And then the fourth group is the one that I puzzled maybe most over, because these migrants are, again, in terms of age, they're young, but they're highly educated. They either have kind of middle school or high school education. They work in manufacturing jobs in Mexico. They live in urban areas, not in rural villages, and they don't come from the typical Central Western places that send migrants to the US. They come mostly from the border and Central South region. Okay, now we're going to go over these again. So here I use the information that we have for everyone, but the MMP surveys actually collected more detailed information about household heads and their spouses. So out of 20,000 migrants, for 5,000, we have a lot more information. Now we can look at this information and learn even more about these groups. So for the first group, we know that they're not educated. They come from rural communities. They tend to be men, Central Western states. Now, almost everyone here is a household head. They tend to be married. They make many trips of short duration to the US. They regularly send back remittances, and they eventually return to Mexico. So to highlight this pattern of going back and forth, I call this group circular migrants. In the second group, we have younger, people, teenagers with some education. They are in poor communities, but their households are likely to own something, so they're kind of maybe middle class in that setting. And from the partial data, we can tell that they are the younger sons in the household. And given their age, most of them are single. They again send remittances and eventually return to Mexico. What sets this group apart, as we'll learn later, is they tend to be mobilized at times of economic misfortune, when there is kind of an economic crisis or other kind of big event that's happening. So for that, I'm calling them crisis migrants. In the third group, it was mostly women with ties to US migrants. And from the partial data, we learned that they tend to be daughters or spouses of US migrants. They tend to be married. They usually make a single trip, and they're the most likely group to settle in the United States. In other words, not returning, not going back and forth. A typical strategy is going once, joining family members there. And for that, I call this group family migrants. Now, the final group. These have the most education. They're most likely to come from urban communities that they tend to be in border or central areas. From the partial data, we learned that they mostly work in factories and they earn the highest wages across all groups there. So to highlight this urban origin, I call this group urban migrants. Okay, so what we've learned so far from this data-driven inductive process is that we seem to have four different migrant groups, and now we can move on to our second question: when does each group migrate? Is there a difference? Are they all present at all time periods, or can we identify some sort of a temporal signature over time? If we look at circular migrants, what we're seeing here is circular migrants as a share of all first-time migrants. So what share of migrants belong to this category? How does that change over time? We see that in the 1960s and 70s, this group made up the majority of all migrants. So about 70% of all migrants fall into this category. We see that the group consistently shrinks in size over time. And since the 1990s, it has been a minority, about 10% of all migrants. And I find this kind of quite powerful because when I think about this group, young, uneducated men from rural communities, this is still the stereotypical Mexican migrant that we think about. And yet they have been the minority group for a long period. If we look at crisis migrants, these are the teenager sons from better off families. What we see is they are kind of a small share, less than 20% in the early years, but by 1980s, they have reached majority. About half of all migrants fall into this category. But then it's like they don't maintain this majority status. They decline in share over time. And still, these days, they seem to be the minority group. When we look at family migrants, these are kind of mostly women joining family members in the US. As you would expect, as more people migrate to the US, some of them settle, there's more reasons for other family members to join them. So we see this kind of secular increase over time. Now, if we pay attention to early 1990s, though, we realize that there's a sudden jump that happens there when this group, within a few years, doubles in size and then kind of maintains that level, going slightly higher maybe. And this is kind of the urban migrants, which actually blows my mind, that this is the group that I least expected to observe. These are kind of people from urban places that are in better jobs in factories, not in the rural sector. So it's not necessarily a story of rural decline. And this group, which was a minority in the earlier years, is the majority in the recent periods. And this group is a lot more educated than the other groups and has a very different profile. So what we see here is a very simple picture that shows each group actually dominates in a different period. So circular migrants defined the 1970s, crisis migrants 1980s to early 1990s, family migrants are always present, but then we have this sudden jump in the 1990s, and urban migrants are slowly climbing to majority in recent years. Now, this actually raises some questions, right? So we see that each migrant is observed in a different period. Now, urban migrants are mostly observed after 1990s and 2000s. And this is a period when education levels, let's say, in Mexico are generally higher. So this raises a question of like, are these differences between groups real? Or are we just observing secular trends in Mexico that the groups observed later are, of course, more educated? In other words, like, is this an artifact of the changes in Mexico, what we're observing here? Now, there are different ways of looking at this, and I'll show you a couple. So if we look at the trends in education in Mexico, this is kind of the non-migrants in my data, the gray line. We see that an average person had about 4 years of schooling in the 1960s, and nowadays it's about 8 years. So there's definitely change. Now, if we look at different groups in our data, our least educated group are the circular migrants, and our most educated group are the urban migrants. So we observe a similar secular trend in both groups, right? So both groups are becoming more educated. But if we look at the differences between circular migrants and urban migrants, it's kind of constant, right? In other words, in every year, urban migrants seem to be different from circular migrants. In other words, we're not just capturing changes over time that affect everyone. There is something different about the way these groups get selected from the overall pool. And then we can look at trends in urban residents. Now, Mexico has urbanized like a lot of developing countries. If we look at the MMP data, we don't really see this trend here. So if we look at share living in an urban area, it seems flat in the MMP data. But it has to do with where the MMP goes to capture migrants, because the idea is not to capture Mexico at large, but to capture migrant-sending regions of Mexico. That's why we're not seeing that urbanization trend here. But for our purposes, what matters is, are the differences in urban residents between groups real? And again, we see this kind of stable difference between urban migrants and circular migrants. Again, it's not a matter of change in population. And then trends in wealth, again, we see more and more families owning properties in Mexico, but then the difference between our poorest and richest groups it's something that exists in every year, regardless of this trend. In other words, the differences we observe between these groups is something different than the time in which we observe these groups. Okay, there's another way of looking at this, which is kind of more model-based, but I always kind of believe these kind of raw figures. I need to see things in raw figures before I kind of put them in a very complicated model that I don't know how to interpret. So it's basically building this argument slowly. But then if we do have a statistical model that tries to predict who's going to be a circular migrant based on these attributes, we basically, again, see these differences. So here, these are estimates from statistical models. There are 4 models in each of these gray areas. And in each model, the outcome we're trying to predict is whether someone is going to be a migrant of that kind. Like, are you going to be a circular migrant, a crisis migrant, a family migrant, or an urban migrant? And how well these different attributes predict that. So the dashed line is the line of 0, meaning that if a dot, the parameter estimate, falls on it, it means it's not statistically significant. It might just as well be by chance. And what we see here is that if you look at the dots where they are in relation to that dashed line, if it's below, it means that it has a negative effect on the odds of migration. If it's above, it has a positive effect. You can see how the dots basically jump around. This is basically telling us that the same thing has different effects on the likelihood of migration for groups. So if you look at years of education, if you're a circular migrant, the less educated you are, the more likely you are to become a circular migrant. If you're an urban migrant, it's the opposite. You're positively selected on education, meaning that you're more educated than your non-migrant counterparts. Again, it's the stereotypical description of Mexican migrants is that they're negatively selected on education. They're less educated than Mexicans. Basically, we're getting the least educated people from Mexico, but that doesn't seem to be the case. With urban migrants, we're getting more educated people than an average Mexican. But again, if we kind of pooled all of these groups together and just try to predict who's going to become a migrant, then you get an average effect that depends on how big each group is. So you're really not capturing the nuances or the changing dynamics of migration, and you get stuck in this kind of averaged description. Same thing with land. Some groups are positively selected on land ownership, and other groups are negatively selected. Meaning that the distinct characteristics we observe for each group are not just about changing Mexican population over time. The pool is changing for sure over time, over 50 years, but the way different groups are selected is also different. So we're capturing that. Now, the question is, why is this happening? So if you think about it, until now, I did not consider anything related to the context of migration, right? All we did was use individual attributes, household characteristics, community characteristics to identify different groups. We then looked at it over. But over a 50-year time period, so many things are changing, both in Mexico and in the US. Now we want to understand how these bigger macro level changes are related to the rise and fall of these different groups. So what is the bigger explanation for these dynamics? Now, basically, the way I know about this is asking, are these groups responding to different macro level conditions. Now, this is actually a useful exercise for many reasons. One, we want to understand what's happening, but two, if the groups that we discovered from this algorithm are real groups, then they should respond differently. If there's different drivers for migration, different factors related to migration, we should be able to observe that. So in a way, it's a way of externally validating this clustering. We're using data that we haven't used so far to see, again, are these groups real? Now, what macro level factors we consider? Here I went back to the classical theories of migration, both at the micro and the macro level. Like we know that if we're kind of after an economic explanation, we should measure wages in both countries. And migration should be sensitive to the wages, employment patterns, unemployment rates. It should also be sensitive to border enforcement, right? So border enforcement supposedly increases the cost of migration. So migrants should respond to that. Now, the new economics theory that I talked about, which was all about household risk diversification, cares about economic fluctuations rather than levels. So people have used inflation in Mexico or peso devaluations in Mexico as a marker of that to measure the level of uncertainty in the economy. The relative causation idea is all about how many people you have in the US that are from your community. And for that, we can look at, Mexican migrant stocks in the US. We can look at availability of visas for family reunification to capture this idea that it becomes a family process over time. We can also look at changes in migrant-heavy industries in the US. The world systems theory I talked about, which had to do with capitalist expansion, is all about how integrated the economies are. So people have used trade, changes in trade for that. We can look at demographic factors like declining birth rates in Mexico. So basically, these are all the things that we as social scientists have identified as things that should matter to migration. Now, the question I'm asking is, do these things matter differently to different groups? Now, here I'm showing just some results, but we don't have to pay attention to the numbers. Basically, again, we're trying to predict each migrant group's rise and fall. So we're trying to predict how many people fall into these categories over time, the figures that I showed, and then I'm using in this model all the indicators that I talked about. Now, what I'm showing here, the numbers are are standardized estimates, meaning that what happens if this indicator was to increase one standard deviation above its mean? Suddenly there's an increase. How much would migration increase or decrease as a result of that? And the orange color means that that indicator is statistically significant. Now, I color-coded this just to show that if we're considering the 4 groups of migrants, what is significant for each group is slightly different, right? They're not all reacting to the same conditions. In fact, some conditions only affect one group and not the others. Again, I'll kind of go through this with figures rather than these numbers. For circular migrants, what most is correlated with their mobility seems to be the level of US wages. More people move into this category or move as a circular migrant when the wages in the US are higher, and when Mexican GDP per capita is lower, so Mexico is doing worse, and when border enforcement budget is lower. And then some of these correlations are so strong that you can actually see it in raw data. So again, I plotted here in the white line the circular migrants in our data. And the yellow line this time is showing hourly wage for production workers in the US. We can also do it for farm workers. These are real wages, so inflation adjusted. And then what we see is basically as the wages decline, there's less and less migrants kind of circulating between Mexico and the US. When we look at border enforcement budget, we see almost a mirror image. This group is highest when circulation is possible, meaning that border enforcement is at low levels. So that way you can come back and forth. And as border enforcement ramps up in the late 1980s, then you also see kind of the circular pattern dying down. So this category no longer kind of is the largest, not even close. So if we think about explanations we have for migration, circular migrants are as close as it gets to this kind of rational economic model of mobility that responds to opportunities and constraints, right? So this group is highly visible, highly present when the wages are higher, and declines directly proportional to the amount of border enforcement there is that is also determining the cost of migration. So again, looking at heterogeneity also allows us to say, well, maybe not every theory applies universally to everyone. Maybe some theories apply to some groups or become more or less relevant in certain periods. Now, what about the second group? Now, as you can see, the second group is not responding to wages at all. The correlations are not statistically significant. Border Patrol budget still matters, and Mexican inflation rate also matters. Now, again, we can just plot raw figures here. Here, the white line is the share of crisis migrants in the data, and the yellow line is capturing Mexican inflation rate. So in the 1980s, 1976 and 1982, there were back-to-back peso devaluations, and inflation rates, which I'm showing here in the yellow line, really soared. So it was a period of economic uncertainty, and a lot of kind of economic historians have described this period as maybe the lost decade for the country because of that. So we basically see the mobilization of younger sons from slightly better off families really coincides with this period. And in the book, there's a lot of qualitative data that I draw on from this period that talks about how even better off families found themselves in distress in this situation. So the strategy was sending, younger sons while the household had remained behind to manage the local economic activities. So the rise of this group seems to be in direct response to these kind of national conditions. And then if it's all about risk and economic uncertainty, again, this aligns better with the new economics model of migration rather than the neoclassical model. Now, one question I ask myself is, if crisis migration is a thing, if these younger sons are mobilized under certain conditions, then we should see this under kind of localized crisis as well. So it doesn't have to be a nationwide crisis. So I look at kind of a couple of things like that. So one is the coffee crisis in the 1990s that affected the coffee producing regions in Mexico. So here, the darker gray states, Veracruz, Puebla, Oaxaca, and Chiapas, are places that provide 90% of coffee production in Mexico. And for their GDP, majority of their GDP also comes from coffee. So in the 1990s, there was a global drop in coffee prices. So I wanted to see, do we see an increase in crisis migration from these regions right after this period? And what we see is precisely that. We see that the number of crisis migrants double only in these coffee growing states after the coffee crisis and not elsewhere in Mexico. Another event was the earthquake in the 1980s, 1985, that hit Mexico City, but also affected all the surrounding states that I'm showing in dark gray here. And we see the same pattern. After this kind of unexpected shock, crisis migration increased by 50% in the states that were hit by the earthquake, and it didn't move much in the rest of the country. So these are kind of meso-level analyses here, if you will, that make me believe the story a little bit more here, increasing the confidence in these kind of aggregate regression estimates. And, this is also kind of a tension, right? So some social scientists and mostly economists are interested in causal estimates. And to get a causal estimate, you basically need to isolate one factor, and then you need to find a source of variation in that factor that doesn't directly affect migration rates. And I really kind of applaud this kind of work. I've done some of this in my work, for example, using railroads in Mexico, the way they were developed, and linking that to migrant networks, and then trying to understand how migrant networks then affect different, outcomes over time. But if you want to kind of account for multiple things, not just isolate one thing, it's almost hopeless. Like, you can't really get at a causal story. What I'm trying to do here is that I have a descriptive story, but I'm trying to corroborate it at different levels with different kinds of data, with maybe historical detail, qualitative analysis, these different kind of more macro and meso level analyses But again, it's still a largely descriptive story. Now, family migrants, what is related to their rise and fall? One thing that stands out that didn't exist for other groups is the availability of visas to Mexicans. That is strongly correlated with family migrants. Now, here again, the white line is showing family migrants and the yellow line is showing the number of green cards given to Mexicans. Now you can see that it was pretty flat, the yellow line, but then something happened in the 1980s and suddenly Mexicans got a lot more visas. And this is right after Immigration Reform and Control Act, the last kind of comprehensive immigration reform in the United States in 1986. And this basically started heavier investment in Border Patrol on the one hand, but on the other hand, it opened a path to legalization for over 2 million Mexicans. So within a few years of the legislation, more Mexicans gained the right to petition to bring their family members. So basically, this doubling in family migrants that we saw in the early 1990s is a direct result of this policy. Again, here, if we wanted to look for kind of a theory that aligns with this idea, we go back to the cumulative causation model, where we recognize that migration, it might start as an economic process, but eventually it gains social dynamics and family unity becomes as important a motive as kind of economic opportunities, perhaps. And we see this most applicable to the case of family migrants. Now, what about the enigma of urban migrants? At least for me, what explains their rise? Now, the strongest correlation that we see here is to that between trade, between Mexico and the United States. This is the only group whose mobility is correlated with increasing trade between two countries. Now, how do we see that in raw data? So basically, the yellow line here is the logarithm of US exports to Mexico, and we see that after 1986, when Mexico signed GATT, Generalized Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, which was a precursor to World Trade Organization, there's a sudden jump in trade. And then after NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, there is like a strong upward trend in trade. And, there is some correlation here that we see between the two trends. But what is the mechanism? What is the explanation? And for that, I go to kind of the world systems idea. So Saskia Sassen maybe has written most vividly about this, the way foreign direct investments concentrate jobs in certain locations. So in Mexico, this would be kind of the border region with the maquiladoras, and then those jobs would attract a lot of internal migrants. But those internal migrants could not always be employed in these areas because of high job turnover and maybe failures of infrastructure, and eventually people would move internationally. And this is a story that Sassen showed in many regions of the world. And in Mexico, this might also be one explanation for why urban migration, especially from the border regions, has increased. And again, we can look at specifically at regions that are most kind of exposed to foreign investments. And in Mexico, this would be kind of the border states. So for 3 border states, we actually can look at the share of urban migrants here. The states with highest exposure to foreign investments in terms of how much their GDP comes from that is Baja California, Chihuahua, and Nuevo León. And then when we look at these states, we see that 70% of migrants fall into the urban migrants category here. And we see a stark increase in urban migrants in these states alone after specifically NAFTA. So again, we have kind of a hunch that this might be related to this kind of process. And there is some qualitative evidence to suggest that, but again, it's just, you can kind of assume it's more tentative. So what have we learned through this? What have I learned through this experience? So first, I tended to describe Mexicans as like one large group, but by doing this exercise, you actually see there are different waves of Mexican migrants, and each wave seems to dominate in a different period. And second, this points to the possibility that there are different reasons for people's mobility. We might kind of reduce it to, yes, economic differences or social factors, but actually the actual driving forces are quite different. For circular migrants, it seems more about opportunities and possibility of traveling back and forth, like maintaining ties with family, but at the same time working in the US and coming back. For crisis migrants, it seems to be a very specific event that triggers mobility and a very specific group, like younger kids, migrating to help the family. For family migrants, it's basically keeping families together, especially in a context when it's hard to go back and forth. So these are different mechanisms, and if we wanted to intervene or understand them, we would need to think differently about them. And for social scientists, I think the lesson here is that we sometimes want to treat theories as universal statements that apply to everyone uniformly across the population, but actually we should recognize them as very conditional statements, right? So they work in specific contexts, they should work for specific groups of people. And Jim Coleman, who was a Chicago sociologist, maybe put it best. He said these theories are sometimes true, not always true, but there are conditions under which they become more true than others. And finally, these kind of using descriptive methods like cluster analysis really allowed me to get a handle on heterogeneity, which is kind of easier to do with qualitative analysis, but with quantitative data, our methods sometimes are too limited and produce only one kind of result. And to believe in these descriptive results, I also had to do a lot of kind of reading and understanding and historical material. The detailed work done by historians in specific regions was really crucial in piecing together this evidence. So it's not like one kind of evidence, but basically trying to bring many different angles to the same story to believe that this is what's going on, to really kind of add nuance to maybe kind of more simplistic descriptions. So I'll stop here. And although I've been done with this for many years, this talk actually made me excited again about this. And nowadays I'm working again on the Mexican migration, but thinking about how climatic events impact mobility, which is something I never thought of writing this book. So my mind is still here. I'm really looking forward to hearing any thoughts you might have. So thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Let's see now. Hold on a second. Yes.
I see Renee.
We don't have a lot of time for questions. This was really comprehensive, fabulously rich, thought-provoking. Thank you, Filiz. Renee, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Filiz. This is a wonderful. I always learn when I hear your research. So I have two reactions. The first one is typically in science we want to find the last standing theory, the theory that has the most predictive power. So we ideally want to be in a situation where we can reject theories that are not very predictive. But here you're essentially proposing that we should keep them all because all of them may actually have predictive power in some context. Do you feel that in other contexts we might have the same situation? That if we were to go beyond Mexico, we would find that theorists may have predictive power in particular settings. My second question is about thinking about the implications of your work for theories of immigrant adaptation. Because these theories about how immigrants do over time across generations, they tend to think of immigrant groups as a block, as a national category. And here your work really compellingly shows how there's a lot of heterogeneity within the same national level. But what would be the take-home point from your work to these theories? If I'm trying to build a model of immigrant adaptation, what are the factors that I need to consider based on your work in order to have a fuller picture? Because you're showing changing selection, right? But what are the specific factors that I need to bring in and import into to have a better understanding of how immigrants
Yeah, I
do over
mean,
time?
no, I'll go quick because I know I just went over time, I realized. So I think, I mean, it's such kind of deep questions, right? So I think one thing that I get from this is like how context puts a cloud over, if you will, on everything else we measure. So in other words, kind of one thing that I take away is like the importance of configurations. Like we sometimes single out one thing, like gender matters. but then gender means something else depending on what else it comes up with, right? It comes with in terms of a configuration. Like being a woman in a city, working in a professional job is different from being a woman in a rural area married with 7 kids. So I think like this is kind of the way kind of I'm thinking about like these configurations change what different things mean. So I think we need to think more about configurations, especially in immigrant integration. I think sometimes we kind of measure one at a time, right? Like what is economic integration? What is social integration? How does it vary by these groups? But it doesn't really capture how these things hang together, both in terms of determinants and outcomes. So I think not easy to do, but that's kind of one thing that I think about. In terms of like what this means for theories, keeping them all, I think we need to keep kind of challenging these theories and kind of leaving the ones that no longer work or leaving the ones that are too restrictive. But at the same time, I think just because something didn't work in one context or didn't explain the most variation doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, right? So I think I'm much more interested in kind of understanding. That's why I think when I think about immigration policy, sometimes I get this question like, what should we do? It depends, right? So it's like one policy is not going to create a uniform effect on everyone. So if you want to kind of create specific outcomes, maybe kind of you need to think about this variation, like who will react to what type of situation. So I didn't really give an answer, but like this is how I think about the complexity here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. If anybody's interested, please raise your hand. I don't see any, but I do have one. Oh, I do have Camilo. Go ahead, ask your question. Yes. You're muted. Camilo, you're muted.
Yeah, okay, there it is. Okay, I'll go very quickly. I have a question about the urban migrants and whether there's any sign that when they are in the US, they have a different sort of social economic outcome vis-a-vis the prior migratory waves, or whether, you know, the changes over time in US society even make that comparison possible. So yeah, what's happening in the US with the latest wave of migrants?
So happy to see you, Camilo.
Yeah.
So with urban migrants, this was actually, I was surprised by them. And I was talking to Doug Massey, and Doug Massey said, well, there's been a lot of increase in temporary migration, you know, after NAFTA that the Congress is quietly approving, but not really talked about. So he sent me this data on temporary visas given to people. And then I looked at it in the Mexican Migration Project too. So in the rest of the migrant population, about 85% are undocumented, right? So with the circular migrants and crisis migrants, its predominant way of moving is undocumented. With family migrants, a good share of them are coming through IRCA visas and petitions, so they're documented. With urban migrants, it is the highest share that migrates with visas, like temporary statuses and other things. So that's, I think, very different. And that is related to, in part, NAFTA. So I think that is one kind of outcome. In terms of return rates, we have less time to observe whether they return or not. But the general trend is return rates are declining across the board for a lot of people, because return means like you return for good because you don't know if you're going to come back, especially when you're undocumented. But, you know, yeah, there are differences. In terms of earnings in the US, urban migrants makes the most money. Crisis migrants, the kids, the children, make the least. So there are differences in like how they do once they cross the border.
Great, thank you. I think unfortunately we are out of time, but I have to say, I mean, maybe just to extend this by 1 minute, and I was going to pose it as a question, but it made me think, you know, for those of us who are not demographers or sociologists and so on, I mean, one obvious but profound takeaway is that, you know, there's something that is masked when you talk about Mexican migration historically. What you show clearly is that there are very different ones overlapping, changing over time, and that perhaps even sort of speaking of them in the plural, you know, and distinguishing them is a way to sort of grasping, you know, the complexity and the evolving complexity of the phenomenon. We are, however, out of time. I would like to say that this has been an unusually stimulating talk, and I really hope we can invite you back at some point later to talk about the environmental components of this story as you develop that research. In the meantime, on behalf of all of us here, I really want to thank you for sharing your work with us. Belatedly, unfortunately, but it's still quite relevant, and to many of us, quite significant in the way we think about these issues. So thank you, Filiz, for joining us. We hope to bring you back whenever you want, and thank you all of you for participating in the seminar today. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Great
Goodbye.
to see
Thank
you,
you. Can I
Feliz.
join as an audience? Bye, Lorena.
Yes, yes,
Can I join as an audience from
yes,
now on?
yes, of course, of course.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Just hold on, Filiz, a second, and we'll talk.